Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast, What's Your History Textbook Left Out? Today, we'll be talking to Professor Lee Panich about the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and its history within the Bay Area, California. I guess just launching off, I saw some of the work or like the presentation you did during the Native American Symposium, and
Mhm.
actually talked with Miss Baines already about the organization process and also Professor DeCoste about, I guess, the more theological aspects of a lot of this history. But I noticed I was taking a particular interest in a lot of the history of the Muwekma Ohlone, as you mentioned during the symposium, and the origins of how a lot of the I guess the border the tribes along the coast were ignored during federal recognition. Would you be able to give kind of a background of your research into the subject and kind of just introduce your research?
Yeah, sure. Just as a quick introduction to my research, I'm an archaeologist and a historical anthropologist, and I'm interested in basically, how Native people here in California dealt with the imposition of the Spanish mission system and then subsequent forms of settler colonialism during the Mexican period and then after American annexation. So the question is, kind of geographically speaking, what are the differential impacts of the missions on tribes that continue to reverberate until today? And so the main thing that you can see kind of geographically across California is that if you look at a map of federally recognized tribes, one striking thing is that there's a lot of federally recognized tribes in California. There's 110 out of 574 nationally, so a good, proportion of tribes are here in California, almost 20%. So that's really impressive. But when you look at where those tribes are on the, modern day landscape, you'll notice that most of them are not along the coast, at least from, say, northern San Diego County up to, say, through Marin or Sonoma County. There's a big gap along the coast and kind of the inland valleys directly inland from the coast where there aren't very many federally recognized tribes. San Diego County is a little bit different because the missions played out a little bit differently there, but by and large, the only tribes on the coast are the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash and then the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria who are in Marin. And so basically the upshot is that because of the impacts of missionization, when the government went to give land to tribes and when, in conjunction with early anthropological studies, basically the judgment of the government and anthropologists, and there were some synergistic effects between them, was that the tribes whose ancestors had been in the missions were not, in their view, authentically, Native American. And this is obviously kind of a problematic judgment, but it's one way that the impacts of the missions kind of continue to reverberate for tribes today, because that process of allotting land happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century, kind of right when anthropology was getting started in California. And, the government and early anthropologists were, operating under this kind of essentialist model of culture, which posited that, if, tribe A had, been in the missions and started speaking Spanish and started practicing agriculture and no longer practice some of their traditional cultural traditions, that then they were no longer, quote unquote, authentic. So it's this really kind of pernicious idea about what constitutes, quote unquote, real Native Americans that continues to really affect tribes in California today.
Yeah, definitely. And to my understanding, there was definitely alongside the mission, rising into the Mexican period with the secularization of the missions, a lot of these native peoples were treated as kind of a labor force on the missions instead of like, I guess, inhabitants of the land. I guess how, for example, for the Muwekma, my understanding was they, like the people who they worked under were the Seminoles and a lot of the people who I guess this contemporary California area is named after, and eventually under Phoebe Hearst near the Verona station. Kind of how was this kind of unique setting playing a role in, I guess, the federal government's recognition uh, of these tribes?
Yeah. So for sure, I mean, so the Muwekma Ohlone tribe are one of the many unacknowledged tribes of California, and so for the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, their lack of federal status is directly tied to what happened in the missions. Um, and so, as the missions were being secularized, that is, they're being closed down and turned into, just kind of parish churches in the 1830s and 1840s, the mission lands were essentially um, stolen from local Native people by settlers. And so the ancestors of the Muwekma, especially those folks who had been at Mission Santa Clara, Mission San Francisco, and the Muwekma also have particularly strong ties to Mission San Jose. As their ancestors were losing access to those lands, they moved a little bit further east into the area that today we would know as Sunol, Niles, and Pleasanton. Um, and there, some of their ancestors worked on, some of the ranchos there, as you mentioned, owned by Antonio Suñol, so the Bernal family, and others. Eventually, as you mentioned, Phoebe Apperson Hearst owned a lot of that land. And so they, you know, moved out there starting in the 1850s, and by the 1860s, really had a thriving community in that area. Um, and by the early 20th century, had attracted the attention of some early anthropologists, um, and really had a cultural revival in the late 19th century out there in that area around Pleasanton and Sunol. Um, the kind of disconnect came in the early 20th century. As I mentioned, some of the anthropologists that went out there were kind of operating under this assumption that to be an authentic California Indian tribe, that you needed certain attributes which they didn't find there. And so folks like Alfred Kroeber, who was kind of the grandfather of California anthropology, he went out and visited the Ohlone ancestors that were living there in Pleasanton pretty early on in the 20th century, but then directed his focus and that of his students elsewhere in the state. There was an anthropologist by the name of John Peabody Harrington, who did spend quite a bit of time during the 1920s with the Ohlone ancestors living in Pleasanton in that area. Unfortunately, he never really published his results, which kind of led into this idea that the folks living out there, didn't need land, weren't a cohesive community. And that was really the judgment of one BIA official in 1927 who just decided kind of off the cuff that the people living there around Pleasanton and did not need land. And they were called by the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the precursor of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, called them the Verona Band of Alameda County, although they themselves, I don't think, would have used that term.
I think it was like the BI agent Lafayette Dorrington or something.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Lafayette Dorrington. And he was, there's other scholars have written about him. He was, let's just say he wasn't great at his job. And this is one kind of, legacy of that, is that he just decided that in one of his letters, he acknowledged, yeah, there's a community living there, but I don't think they need land. And then that was kind of it. And, it's really an unfortunate kind of historical accident.
One perspective I did while doing some research on the subject, I found that it was just that he was kind of lazy and kind of incompetent at his job, and that was kind of like this mix-up also stemmed from a lack of effort on his part. And I just felt like part of like the topic of federal recognition being so important, especially in the contemporary context, being treated with such like disregard is kind of like the polarization of the two sides is really apparent when you think about it in this kind of context.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing that, something as important as federal recognition could just be, just somebody not doing their job. But I guess at that time, the relationship wasn't as, or the idea of federal recognition was a little bit different. And really he was, I'm not trying to defend him in any way. And I've read the same things that said he was fairly incompetent across the board, and not just in this case, but, his task was really to identify tribes that needed land. And so it wasn't, the whole idea of federal recognition operated a little bit differently in those time periods. But yeah, it is just kind of this, that decision on his part has huge ramifications.
Yeah. I guess moving to a bit more of a contemporary setting, the recent like kind of trail of truth, that the Muwekma Ohlone efforts for federal recognition. Uh, I know that there's been a lot of work, especially from the chairwoman of the Muwekma Ohlone and the entire community kind of pushing for this status. How do you think the role of learning more about history in the history of the Muwekma Ohlone and other tribes around this area can play a role in better understanding, I guess, contemporary fights for recognition?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, it's great that they are seeking, greater visibility in their fight for federal recognition. It's something, that kind of the restoration, as they would say, of their federal recognition, bringing it back to pre-1927 levels, is something they've been working on. The tribe's been working on since the 1980s, and it's critically important for the tribe to achieve this. And I think one of the difficult things is that here in the Bay Area, there's literally millions of people that live here, and although the tribe is fairly substantial, I think there's over 600 people in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, or 600 individuals that are enrolled. You know, that's compared against the millions and millions of people that live in the area. You know, their struggle tends to get lost in the you know everything else that's going on in the Bay Area, right? We live in a very diverse place. There's lots of, people are politically engaged in all sorts of different things. And so I think, there's that aspect that it's, been challenging for them to kind of have their fight be as visible as certain other ones. And so I think, the Trail of Truth was a great opportunity to kind of bring their struggle and their kind of fight for the restoration of federal recognition to a broader audience through, social media and so on, and just being out there and the different, events that they put on. Certainly super important. Sorry, did that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I guess speaking more on this, like the nonprofit Unfold for All, the main mission is to, through education, kind of raise awareness about these, as you mentioned, kind of buried or underrepresented histories. Uh, what do you think, like the role of education, starting, I guess, particularly early on, maybe elementary, middle school, high school? How do you think the role of education plays in the importance of these subjects? Like how do they develop opinions within people?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think, you know, the example of my own kids who just have gone through fourth grade recently, that's where you learn about the missions if you're growing up in California is in fourth grade. And that's, largely kind of traditionally been the end point of Native histories in the way that they're presented in the public school curriculum here in California is that, Native people lived here, the Spanish showed up, they went into the missions, and then we're on to the Mexican period and statehood and all of that. And so I think the traditional way of understanding the history of the state kind of tends to downplay the continued presence of Indigenous communities here in the state. And certainly I think that's true for tribes that don't have federal recognition, like the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. The fact that they don't have federal recognition is amplifies their erasure from the kind of modern day landscape, but also the curriculum. So I think, yeah, education is crucially important. I know that in the last few years, there's been a lot of great movement on restructuring the fourth grade curriculum to, talk about some of the more complex and, issues regarding the missions and their legacy, certainly to kind of highlight the continued presence of tribes here in California. So there are, both in the public school system and in even the Catholic schools, there's been a lot of curriculum work done in the last 10 years. And I think, it's heading in a good direction. As a college professor, I still get lots of students though who say like, oh, I didn't realize there was still a tribe here in the Bay Area. Or I still didn't realize I didn't realize that Native communities were still around here in the Bay Area and that kind of thing. And so that's, I see it as my job to partly kind of, especially being here at Santa Clara University where we have the mission on campus, my job for sure is to kind of bring those histories to the forefront so students can, realize that this is a really important contemporary issue, not just something that happened in the past.
Definitely, yeah. My family lives right next to Mission San Jose in Fremont.
Mhm.
And just like walking by the mission every single day or every single week on my way to I guess not really the downtown area of Fremont, but just an area with a lot of stores. There's not really much at the forefront of the building that indicates that it has anything to do with Indigenous history at all. It
Mhm.
just seems it's I guess treated as I guess more of a museum now. They have like a gift shop and everything,
Right.
but there's not much about it besides the fact that oh, this was a really important part of California history and doesn't really delve into anything beyond that. So I guess I'm not sure if it's I mean part of it's definitely intentional or the blurring of history from the past, but there's just a lot of this context being lost within this really integral part of California history. And I guess developing on this, what do you think and as a college professor, how do you think higher education or individual research takes a role in, I guess, spreading the awareness about these subjects?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's important across the board. I mean, I think, getting to your last question, I mean, I think I can't remember when it's supposed to phase in, but there is the new ethnic studies requirement in high schools in California, which is, I think important. But certainly in, colleges and universities, the different systems, the community colleges, Cal States, UCs, and then all the private colleges, there's a lot of different, factors that govern the curricula that is put forward. But I think, most people in the social sciences and historical sciences would recognize that we need to amplify the voices of different communities here in California that really, haven't been included in the traditional histories of the state. So I think that's, true of obviously of Native history, which is what I study, but, across the board. I mean, if we think about other aspects of California history that are perhaps less well known and are quite, um, challenging, Chinese exclusion, all sorts of things like that, those are things that people living in California ought to know.
Definitely, yeah. Uh, I guess this is kind of diverging from the central line of focus here. But one thing I was just generally curious about is your take on, I guess, land acknowledgements and
Mhm.
the practice of that throughout universities. There's been kind of a divide with some people recognizing it as an important step, while others kind of the controversy surrounding it being that it's not enough and it kind of satisfies the quota of recognition without concrete action. So how do you think either what do you think of like land acknowledgements as a concept, and how do you think it can either be improved or changed in the future?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think I'm sympathetic to the view that land acknowledgements can often be performative, especially when, presented in kind of a corporate, situation or at a university event where there's nothing else behind it, right? Um, I think so. Yeah, there's a lot of area to critique. There's, room for improvement, obviously. I mean, one interesting thing about land acknowledgements is they are, to a certain degree, kind of situated in indigenous protocols, to recognize the different homelands of, in which the speaker is situated. So that's, there is I think, a kind of a nugget of kind of authenticity to why one might want to do that, or to offer a land acknowledgement, kind of rooted in these protocols. Of course, as a non-Indigenous person, I think that another, they can be performative, especially like I said, when you just kind of, it's just something to get through at the beginning of an event. Um, so it's a complex issue. I'd say in the case of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, I've heard the folks that we work with in the tribe, I've heard a couple of things about land acknowledgements. One is on the kind of pro land acknowledgement side, is that it is kind of a moral statement, right? That, even if it's done in kind of an off the cuff way, it is, recognizing, especially for a community like the Muwekma Ohlone, who is not federally recognized, it is, an important step for an institution like, say, Santa Clara University or whatever it is that, is fairly powerful in the community to say, we recognize that we're on the ancestral homelands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and, other Ohlone communities. So that's a fairly powerful statement if it's backed up by, actual action. And that's the other kind of thing that I've heard from folks from the tribe is that, you know, these statements need to be linked to some kind of concrete action. So that's, it's a complex question. I think here at Santa Clara, we've had the land acknowledgement only, I think, for 5 or 6 years, maybe since 2018 or something like that. Um, and so, yeah, there's room to grow in that sense, in terms of the land acknowledgement really only says we acknowledge that we're on the homelands of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people, and we, take a moment of silence to pray for their ancestors and present community or something to that effect. But I think it could have a second part, which is, if you want to support Ohlone people, you can give to our Ohlone Student Scholarship Fund, or you can do XYZ.
Yeah. And I guess another aspect of like concrete action, there's been the issue of like gentrification and
Mhm.
repatriation. Uh, I think Cal schools. I was listening to a podcast from the chairwoman of the Muwekma Ohlone, And though there's definitely been progress on these regards, I think one of the statements that really caught me off guard was how there are still the remains of a lot of like my ancestors stored within a lot of these schools, and whether that be the UC schools or institutions such as Stanford, who I guess the issue or the image is that these are some of the most progressive schools in the nation. Uh, have just what's your opinion on the subject, and how can we go forward with reparations?
Yeah, so it's definitely a complex question, or a complex issue. So the main, well, I mean, the root of the issue is, right, that archaeologists and amateur archaeologists, essentially grave robbers, for probably 100 years or more, throughout California went out and desecrated, indigenous cemeteries. Some of this was just, kind of literally under the cover of night. Some of it was more under the, rubric of scientific archaeology. End result is the same, that there's, tens of thousands of Native Californian ancestors, literally stored in boxes in various museums and universities across the state. Um, the there is a process that's been ongoing since the 1990s to repatriate these remains. And actually, Stanford did willingly repatriate a lot of the remains to the Muwekma Ohlone even before this law was passed in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a mouthful. So most people just use the acronym NAGPRA. So NAGPRA is the law that governs this at the federal level. But the challenge for tribes like the Muwekma is exactly kind of what we were talking about at the beginning, is that because they don't have federal recognition, they cannot, under the federal law, request the repatriation of their ancestors from places like UC Berkeley or wherever. So there is more recently some state laws here in California that are helping to, or trying to help facilitate that process, but it's still pretty slow going. So yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but certainly, Berkeley has lots of ancestors of Ohlone people that were excavated from shell mounds and other sites here in the Bay Area. And that's, the process is ongoing. It's taken way too long, but hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel there.
I guess, yeah, that definitely ties back to the central idea of federal recognition and how that plays such an important role. Uh,
Mhm.
I guess that's all I really had in terms of questions. Did you have anything else that you want kind of to mention?
Um, no, I mean, yeah, happy to answer any other questions, but I think you hit a lot of the main ones. Uh, so in terms of the podcast, are you gonna how does it work? You're gonna splice together like the different interviews, or?
That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to try and get an interview with the chairwoman of the Muwekma
Mhm.
Ohlone first, to kind of make sure, like I want to include as many perspectives as I can before getting this out. Uh,
Yeah.
so I'm trying to schedule that. I think I need to follow up with Miss Baines on getting the contact information for one.
Mhm.
In terms of, I think some of the individual clips I did want to ask you. So in the upcoming, in a couple of days, February, starting from next week, I think I'm going to be going to some of the local middle schools around here, in Dublin, California, and they're just like going over a brief history of the Muwekma Ohlone, uh,
Mhm.
because I think this is right around the time where they're covering Manifest Destiny and a lot of that general history. So
Yeah.
a lot of the teachers were just like, "Oh, this would fit right into the curricula, and it would give some important context to some of that." So I was wondering if I could use some of the clips within this podcast as kind of statements on some of the history.
Yeah, sure. Feel free.
Awesome, yeah. And yeah, so that's all I really had. In terms of like the future, if you're ever available to do something, would I be able to reach out to you again? I think some of the things we're hoping to do is just maybe have online seminars with professors or something to speak on to entire groups of students, whether
Okay.
that's elementary, middle school, high school, to kind of reach a broader audience.
Yeah, sure. Feel free to reach out. I'm around most of the time. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much once again for agreeing to do this, and have a nice day.
All right, cool. You too. Thanks.